mention in Lisp IRC
Oh
that
yeah.
we're streaming? Because I think somebody complained about that a couple weeks ago.
Oh yeah,
Like,
yeah,
why
yeah.
don't you mention on IRC?
Yeah, yeah. If you can do that, that would be great. I guess we'll get started in the meantime. Hi everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Common Lisp Study Group. Today, we will be talking about and going through kind of some case studies on usage of the MOP, the MetaObject protocol, which we've been covering the last couple of weeks. Um, uh, the goal is to be able to come through and go through a couple of examples of open source projects that are using the MOP, hopefully come up with some examples of our own, sort of give you guys some sort of indication on how to use it in your own projects. This is going to be our last, one of our last coverages. Next week is going to be our last coverage of the MOP for a while before our game programming series starts up. Couple announcements. Michael, is the Game Jam information? Do you have any info on the Game Jam coming up?
Yeah, it's April 11th or April 10th, and I just put the website up Monday, so you can go ahead and register now.
Do you have a link? I will post it on.
I do have a link. Let me find it.
Okay. Well, Michael Fiano gets that set up. Today, specifically, we'll be covering, just a little bit of a code review through a very nice library that was written for iCalendar support by Shinmera called iCalendar. I don't know how to pronounce it because it's basically iCalendar without an L. Just to show you the project name, basically implements the RFC 5545 format. It's available on GitHub. I posted a link on the YouTube channel for folks who are watching on YouTube Live. I will post this also for folks who are in the chat, just in case, so that we can get started. This is a pretty nice library that's been covering that uses the iCalendar format, and one of the uses of the way Shinmera at least wrote this, and I've been starting to slowly go through this. One of the Shinmera uses the MetaObject protocol to implement kind of serialization for the different types of parts of the RFC, and that's where we will begin. If there are other particular interesting portions, like I just yesterday started going through this library in a little bit of detail, that folks who are either on the stream watching or folks who are in the Hangout, if you guys want to chime in on other places where it is being used, let me know. So let's start with the protocol. This is where I remember distinctly where the meta objects were created. Now, a lot of the portions of the protocol, from what I can tell, implements this serializable class. Now, there's one kind of difference up until now of the examples that I've written or ported from the book, and the example, at least something that stood out for me here that Shinmera uses, and that is this C2 mop meta object that that he's subclassing from. Now, I tried to hunt down as to what exactly C2mop meta object is. I didn't see anything in the documentation of ClojureMop specifically, and I was wondering if other folks have seen what this was and what what their thoughts are. Like compared to C2 standard class, should we start, subclassing from the C2 MOP MetaObject, or is this trying to essentially make serializable class a kind of at the same level as standard object or standard class? Because I didn't think that you could do that ever, because that kind of violates CLOS in general, right? You have to be at the very least some point inheriting from standard object and true, even at the meta object level. Have other folks seen this used in other projects? I'm trying to just pull up closer MOP here again because I tried to look this up yesterday and I didn't see this when I first did this, but I may have just not found it when I did my digging because I wrote it wrong. No, that's fine. Okay. Okay. So let's go through this. As you can see, serializable classes actually have a couple things that need to be dealt with prior to their initialization piece being complete. One of the things that was particularly noticeable in the use of the MetaObject protocol in iCalendar that I thought was kind of explicit here was I've seen more. I think this is probably one of two instances of him Shinmera actually explicitly implementing an after method for finalize inheritance. Yeah, but that guy. Oh, this is actually the top level. Okay, never mind. This I haven't seen in our uses, and you may have not have seen in our uses of writing extensions to the MOP, where we explicitly had to call out finalize inheritance. I think one of the reasons was since a lot of our stuff was subclassed from standard class, and we've explicitly validated the standard class as being, true. We were able to hook into the explicit machinery, the object-oriented machinery already available for standard class to deal with computing the direct superclasses, dealing with the inheritance structure, and so forth. As a result, this function was not needed to be implemented from scratch. So one thing to know for folks who are writing their own extensions, if you're following, this kind of approach, that I'm at least learning. Now, I can't say if this is true or not. You may, if you are subclassing from standard class, it may be the case that you do not need to implement finalize inheritance because it may have been written for you. If you're doing something complicated like what Shinmera is doing here, where he's checking if the slots were bound, the identifier slot's bound, and then he does some logic in terms of setting up the identifier slot in case the slot wasn't computed ahead of time, and it will, I think in this case, if I remember correctly, this one's just creating a hash. Hold on, let me just double check this. Loop for super in the direct superclasses. So he's getting the superclasses when the serializable class is a subclass. Serializable class is a subclass of the superclass. Then he will finalize it. Just make sure one thing. Subclass P. So inheritance thing is Yeah. If the subclass, if the superclass is also a subclass of serializable class, then he will keep on calling finalize inheritance recursively until it hits a case where the superclass is never a subclass of serializable class, after which he returns the top level class identifier. Weird. So why is he... Oh, he's doing a concat. He's overriding this. So the top level identifier is going to be the one that's going to be associated with the slot itself. Okay. Okay, that makes sense. So you may notice that he's also defining a couple of other things. One is a standard slot definition and a standard direct slot definition, and it's specifically, the inheritance structure is direct parameter slot is a subclass of parameter slot. Now, I'm not entirely sure where the pieces of the protocol that define this particular piece here is, but you may know that the way if you're overriding behavior for slot definitions, you're going to have to go ahead and create your own extension slots for extensions for standard slot definition itself. And if you do end up creating an extension for standard slot definition, at least from what I read in the MOP specification, the API reference, it looks like it may be to your benefit to also create a direct version of that slot definition extension, just so that when you're computing slots later on, the logic for direct slots and doesn't end up being kind of unwieldy in terms of determining which superclass it needs to do to compute the actual effective slot definition meta objects. The other thing that was kind of odd when I was reading through this, and folks, feel free to chime in if you guys have questions, was how he was defining the validate superclasses. Like, he almost spelled out exactly the graph walk that the compiler has to do in order to know what is a valid superclass and what isn't. And you could see that right here, where he is saying that if property class is a subclass, that property class is a subclass of standard class, and any property class can be the superclass of any other property class that's being extended. So you can have this, infinite extension, but you can't have the inverse. A standard class can never be the validation of a property class. It can never be a subclass of a property class. This here, my guess is there is a potential situation where the compiler attempts to do something that it shouldn't be doing. As a result, he spelled out the fact that you need to that no standard class at that level is a subclass of the property class. Although I would think that just adding this unary direction is good enough, but other things. And this is something I actually learned today. I think for folks who are writing, and this is kind of the use case that I was looking at, there's a case where if you want to access slots and augment the slot behavior, you would have to essentially, from my understanding of the MOP specification, I'd love to hear other people's opinion on this, you had to just compute the effective slot definition, and in the compute effective slot definition, you essentially define a new function that essentially that wraps the slot definition with whatever you want to augment it with. Like the example that I was thinking of is if you want to write a log entry to say that this method was invoked at such and such time with a loggable class. The way I was implementing it is after you create uh, your your loggable extensions and you validate it with the superclass like he did here in lines 58 through 60, you would just override compute effective slot definition, compute slots like we did with closette. Now, reading Shinmera's code kind of enlightened me on this because he explicitly calls out the different um, lookup methods for effective slot definition and direct slot definition, both of which it looked like it was being used by compute effective slot definition. So I learned that you have to potentially also override those methods in order to get a full, complete end-to-end extension of your objects. Does that make sense? So basically, if you are trying to do anything that modifies slots for an instance, you would have to implement compute effective slot definition class, and direct slot definition class for for your specific class extension. Once you define those three, it looks like compute slots uses compute effective slot definition anyway, so you don't have to go ahead and override that. That's going to be the standard machinery for any extension of standard class. Are there questions on this? Like, this is kind of my understanding, my breakdown of this particular thing, but I'd love to hear other people's thoughts on this. Questions from folks watching on the stream? Questions in our chat? Let me go and check the chat. Okay. Richie, have you had a chance to go through some of this code?
I tried, but that's what I don't understand much of this.
Okay, let's. Is there any particular section that you were going through in here that or it is kind of like what I'm explaining a little bit clearing up a couple of things, or
My grandma, this is all just way over my head, man.
Yeah, no, the MOP is a pretty crazy is a pretty crazy thing to wrap your head around. I've been struggling myself on going through some of this. Luckily, for folks who have gone through and used what's it other languages reflection libraries, some of this is not as unfamiliar. The problem is the MetaObject protocol has some specific approaches. Like, you have to override particular methods that you need to hook into its machinery correctly. That's kind of where I've been struggling with. And so like there's these top level methods that are there that you could just use as is, but then the actual bits and pieces of the actual underlying machinery, the lower level APIs, is what you need to override. Is something that I've been kind of learning and picking up as I've been slogging through some examples. But I hope this is at least clearing some things up as we go through. So we now, I think let's focus on, I think property classes, because this is something that kind of combines both class extension, which we covered in chapter 3 of the MOP spec, and just setting up your slots. Like I said, if you read the actual MOP spec in chapter 5, which I've also linked in the MOP spec on the YouTube channel, it gives you the compute slots like syntax and its parameters and its description of the implementation. Kind of gives you what methods you need to actually override in order to keep the higher level methods the same, but it will still implement your extensions. So like, I'll give you an example here. Let me pull up compute slots here. Yeah. So compute slots, the specification explicitly says that it computes the effective slot definition object. But how does it do it? Well, for each slot name, the generic function compute effective slot definition is called to compute an effective slot definition. So, and the result of compute slots is a list of these. So the return value is a list of all the effective slot definition objects in an unspecified order. This is important because you could certainly do what we did in our ordered class example, where we sort the actual effective slots before returning them. So now your unspecified order is technically a specified order, but the actual function itself doesn't actually guarantee that the order is going to be specified. But there's a tidbit in that description that is very important to take note of, which is, what is the generic function that's being called? That's usually the hint that you need to take to say, okay, this is a function that I may need to override. So let's look at that generic function. So in compute effective slot definition, there's a couple of things that we need to override, one of which is effective slot definition class. And you can see that right here in the property class example. So we started from compute slots. Compute slots we're keeping the same here in the case of this iCalendar example. We overrode compute effective slots to say that there's more specific things that we need to deal for property classes. Well, in order for us to deal with compute effective slot definitions, we need to actually go and implement and override effective slot definition class on property classes and deal with finding the specific effective slot definitions for that given parameter class. And you can see that in line 67 through 69, 66 through 69 here, which I've highlighted. That all we're doing is we're checking to see if that if the name is nil, then we're finding the actual effective parameter slot, which is another extension that I don't think he wrote. I think this is actually standard. I'll just go double check though. No, he did write it. Okay, so this okay, so now that makes sense. So he's saying that the property classes is going to be having effective parameter slots that need to have some certain behavior overrides. Okay. So he's checking to see in this case the whether the class is nil. If it is nil, go ahead and return the effective parameter slot associated with this property class. Oh, for this slot that's passed into effective slot definition. Otherwise, we know the slot definition class anyway, but we don't know its specificity. So we call next method to get the superclasses method based on the specificity chain to determine what the effective slot definition class should be. This is going to keep going until, if you recall how standard method combination works, because this is a primary method, it doesn't have a before and after extension on it. It's going to be from most specific to least specific in that order. So looking at left to right, it's in the class direct superclasses, it's going to be leftmost to rightmost in the order of genericity. The same thing happens, actually, interesting, to direct slot definition, if you saw that. The difference between direct slot definition and effective slot definition, if you recall, is a direct slot is on the actual class itself. Okay, it's not dealing with the inheritance chain at all. But an effective slot it's actually including and dealing with the inheritance chain. So the chain at which you specified your classes from, most specific subclass to your topmost class, which is usually T. So this is how they implemented, how Shinmera implements property classes as part of the spec. He basically says that, a property class is nothing more than another serializable class with certain instincts on how it should be handled. He uses this property class in its serialization piece, its specificity piece, to actually define the actual property, and defining the actual property just takes in, obviously, a hash table of the parameters that it's going to be associated with the protocol, the value of them, and it being extended from property class. We could see that there isn't any extra metadata information being provided by the property class, but we're changing some of the semantics in how the slot's going to be actually accessed based on the inheritance hierarchy. A lot of this, from what I can tell, has been, at least based on my cursory reading of this library, have been kind of hooks into determining, or it's using the MOP to order your user extended objects without having to specify the ordering, and let the object-oriented machinery, specifically the standard method combination, determine in what order we should actually go ahead and serialize the iCalendar protocol that's being created when you actually take a top-level serializable class. So let's move on. The other thing that he was doing here is you may notice that he's actually leveraging standard slot definitions. He's overriding a lot of extensions of the This is like a really good case study in how to leverage a MOP. Like I said, I haven't been able to go through this in a lot of detail just because it's taking a bit of time in determining the specific piece of each extension, just because, again, up until recently, we kind of focused on writing extensions with standard class, and a lot of the book, in terms of its examples, were subclassing standard class, but not actually dealing with other aspects of the MetaObject protocol. Excuse me. So let me take I threw a lot at you guys. Let's take a small piece. Let me stop and ask if there are particular questions on what we covered so far. Let me just double check to make sure that no one's asking about. Oh, I just realized something. Forgot to. Just give me 1 second here. Okay. Sorry, 1 minute. Just gotta. There we go. This guy. And. Okay. Good. All right. So one of the comments that was made, I don't know who the unknown sender is, but thank you. Apparently, Shinmera also uses it to constrain slot values and raises errors if invalid values are used. Okay. Thank you.
That was when I also posted a link to the video he did when he's actually started writing this.
Okay. Yeah, I just saw that too. I'm gonna post this on. This is a great link. Thanks, Richie. I'm gonna go ahead and post this on the YouTube video description, so that way other folks can have access to it.
Yeah, that was the main reason he started using. Because if you look at the description on the GitHub thing, based on the protocol, it's very strict. So that's why he had to constrain the values for the slots, and that's why he was using the MOP to do that. And I got lost at that point.
Yeah, you can easily get lost as you're going through the MOP spec, the MOP implementation on how he's using it. So I can totally understand. That's what I've been kind of struggling with as I've been going through his stuff.
The video might have been, I forgot to post this when I posted up the thing on Mattermost, but the video might be a good thing to go through to see when he started and then probably revisit.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great idea. I think that certainly will help clear up a couple of things in his approach to using some things in it, because I was surprised. He's really like as he's been going through it. As I've been going through it, it really looked like he needed to add a bunch of constraints to slots, but I didn't know for what reason. And I was like, why is he doing this? This doesn't make any sense. So that video would probably clear up things.
Another good thing to probably do is probably just look at the RFC, look at one piece of the, look at the RFC, look at a value of a slot in part of the correlate the RFC to what he's written, and then look at it, pick a specific thing where the values are constrained, and then look at that within what he's written.
Yeah, that's a good idea. Let's see this. Let me pull up his top level thing so I can actually get access to the RFC. Let's pull up the RFC on Google. Okay. And let's see here. Put the protocol up. Let's see here. Let's put and then let's grab one of the conventions. Property parameters. In order for me to look at this, I need to go with, I guess, the standard types first, which is address list. Yeah, this is the top level mosting of the actual protocol. You define certain sections. Property value data types, iCalendar components, iCalendar properties.
But I think if you go back to what the file you were just looking at, where at the top where it said understand the types, where it's like a day is constrained to between 0 and an integer between 0 and 31,
Yes.
that might be something to look at. Like a weekday, not weekday, sorry, hour list has to be an integer between 0 and
23. Yeah. And then minute list 059. Okay, so he's constraining the actual types that the integer acceptable, a set of acceptable integers for each of the time pieces. He created also the type for the attachment value. URI is a valid URI. Where does he define URI?
But what I was saying, we could let's look at, let's say, our list, and then look at how he defined the MOP to constrain that to be an integer between 0 and 31.
So, okay, I see what you're saying. Let's go look at that. Because this by defining your type this way, because define list type, I'm assuming that that's a that's an extension of def type that did that, or if not, let's see. Define property. Here we go. He creates a series of property classes. This is a macro that he wrote to define new properties. Where is he using this guy? Define property. This is used elsewhere.
It might be easier to use on GitHub find in repository.
Find in repository.
You need to go up to the top.
And
to the left of the AutoCAD. Oh, you probably have to sign it or search. Just do a search.
Oh, search. Got it.
And it should say find in repository. You have a choice of find in repository on all of GitHub.
Ah, got it. All right. Define property. Ah, he actually specifies it in his README. Hold on, let's go look at his README for a second here. He explains some issues. Parameters are just like property values, except strictly type checked. Okay. Okay, now I'm slowly starting to understand what he did. He actually ended up writing essentially a type checker for writing iCalendar events. Like he used a MOP to essentially write and more importantly, the Lisp type system to restrict and do some type checking on the protocol prior to serialization to make sure that it has all valid values. That's actually pretty neat. Okay. This change the type and extra options to define that behavior. There we go. So this is the order in which we have to look at it. Each class is serializable class. We covered serializable class, but we need to cover what is a parameter. A parameter is subclass of parameter direct slots and thus describe custom slot types. These slot types are used in property definitions to ensure that the metadata has the correct type. Yeah. So he's adding type checking for the different portions of the protocol. Let's see how he's doing parameters. Give me a second. I'm going to go and pull up here multiple tabs. Okay, so we talked about, so we have this parameter slot. The parameter slot is serializable. We have a direct parameter slot. It doesn't hold any metadata, but here it is. So for each piece of the extension, he wrote a macro that specifically defines a user-defined class that creates that specific type. He uses that information in the overrides to actually go and do the serialization. So it's not just that we have to look at his use of the MOP. We have to look at his macros to see how those MetaObject classes are actually ultimately being used to determine other aspects of the protocol. So this is kind of the MOP usage is really just like the first layer to define your basic types for, well, your constraints, like you said. That's interesting. Okay. Let's see here. So once each parameter has its meta object, you could then create a property. Properties are valued as classes that have a value slot and slot for each of the supported parameters that you specified earlier. But you could also create non-standard parameters using define property. Okay. And those parameters are basically of the same type, which is what we defined earlier. Okay. So property class is going to standard class. Now you have a defined property as we defined earlier, which is just a hash table of holding all the parameter objects. which can be non-standard than the ones that are available in the RFC. Just double check here. Where is the parameter? He said that there's an X parameter for, oh, there we go. You can define new parameters using define or simply add them to X parameter on the property instance. Okay. So the X parameters is just simply for dealing with anonymous parameters for custom things. Okay, that's fine. What else is there here? Define. Okay, hold on a second, let me just double check something. Component is a number of properties in a slot called X properties for extreme or non-standard properties. Each additional component is used by a defined component. The slot in the component definition is turned into a property slot if the property init arg is present. Oh, okay. So one of the key things about each of these properties before you could define a component is well, how do you define whether or not a property is an optional constraint, a required constraint, can hold multiple values and so forth. And in order to do that, what he did was he created an extension of standard slot definition to provide some metadata specifically for what type of constraint can we have. Okay, and of which it looks like he only specified 2 constraints here in default init args. But I can't seem to tell. I thought he would be required. Let me see where required is. Because I would have thought that he specified. Okay, that's why. He never actually added so one thing to note here in the property slot definition with the metadata, and I might be reading this wrong, so someone else correct me, but in default init args for constraints we have optional, right? But unless you call check slot constraint, which is probably used in elsewhere, technically I think you can actually put anything as long as it's a keyword value in constraint. Am I reading that right? So for the class of the subclass here, this is just a general CLOS question with default init args. I thought that there was a way for us to actually, this might be us specifying a type on constraint, but I thought there was a way for us to constrain the set of valid values, like an enumeration, for a slot member using something. It may have been just type. Am I just overthinking about this?
Well, not to answer your question, but the part where required is, I think, is defined is in standard-components.lisp.
Okay. Okay. Standard-components.lisp.
Yeah, again, I just did a search for required in repository.
Okay. colon. I should be using the search feature like grep a little bit more. Okay. Yeah, but you see, he's being used even in standard components. Doesn't look like a lot of these are just so by all these are actual like subclasses of what eventually is the component meta object. It looks like, and the component meta object. Okay, you know what? The component meta object actually may have that defined. Hold on 1 second. Component class. Where is defined component? There we go. No, it's not. Yeah, so it looks like the way Richie, the way he's doing the constraint checks is he's using essentially a type case to determine the set of valid values, and depending upon what is required, optional, or multiple, he will do some sort of logic. But constraint itself on a given property slot can take anything. It can be, you can actually put in invalid values in here. So it's not actually constraint, but it's constraint through using this function that overrides and makes sure that that is correct. It looks like he also may have missed in here the case where you put in an invalid constraint type. At least looking at this code. Yeah. But that's neither here nor there. I was just wondering how he's constraining some of these this property slot, this slot definition here. But regardless, the core meta object piece here is that this extension to slot definition is basically adding some meta information to the slot itself. It actually reminds me of the attributes example that that was in chapter 3, where you're trying to essentially add some metadata information to a particular slot. Let me just go and look at that just one more time, just to make sure I'm not confusing myself here. I'm pretty sure that that's what the case is. Yeah. Yeah. That's right. That's right. It is the exact thing related to the attributes class. The difference is that the attributes class example in the book uses standard class as its extension, and then my guess is at some point it hooks into standard slot definition to provide information for a given slot. But
what page is that example
on? Page 87, section 352.
Good, thanks.
No problem. If you have the book on you, folks, page 87 through 91, he takes a somewhat different approach, but I think the same pieces can be leveraged here. And the reason I say that he takes a slightly different approach is he doesn't actually implement how attributes classes is, slot definition attributes is implemented. And the authors are like kind of leaving it as an exercise, but the closette implementation that's in the back of the book, I'm sure, has a much more complete implementation of that example. It's in Appendix D. But for folks for more reference information, I will post some of this again as we go through it. Let's see what the other thing is. So he ended up writing. I'm actually impressed. He actually ended up writing quite a few writers here. I'm not entirely sure why though. Like I see now. He had to write the writer in order to handle the constraint check. Okay. So for folks just tuning in and looking at what we're reviewing here, one thing to note is when you're dealing with slot metadata specifically, slot metadata is not often for good reason because it's part of the extension machinery. Not necessarily accessed through compute slots and other aspects of the system for slot access. And as a result, you may end up having to do what Shinmera is doing here is implement the slot access methods to actually go apply your metadata and if you needed to use it to deal with particular ways of handling slot access. Using either before methods like he's using here or just the standard method combination machinery to hook your slot access methods into the existing CLOS machinery. So just to review, what I mean by slot access methods is like the one example here on line 173 that I'm showing you guys. This is that includes things like slot value using class. It uses what was the other one? There's like 3 or 4. Slot value using class is the one, but it's also another thing. And let me go look at chapter 6 again. Here, this is in. Where is it? Here we go. Slot value using class, slot bound using class, slot make unbound using class. And then, of course, the writer that we're using here, which is setf slot value using class. All these are generic functions as part of the slot access API. And again, if you're trying to apply metadata to your slots, this is definitely something that you need to be aware of so that you apply it correctly. Let's see here now. This library is actually a really good library, Richie. Good find, man. Like this actually is a complete, definitely more complete than the ones that I've been coming up with in terms of examples of using the MOP. Okay. The rest of this, I'd like to be able to give us some time to do more of a thorough thing. I'm gonna watch the video that Richie provided, and we could revisit the rest of this because I just want to give you guys a little bit more of a complete understanding of what's going on, at least based on my thing. Like I said, I looked at this mainly from the MOP perspective purely, but I didn't get an understanding of the use case. So some of this may have been a little bit slightly confusing. I hope the video that Richie provided that I posted, hopefully, on the YouTube Live. If not, I will certainly do so before we leave. No, I did. Okay. Let me actually do one thing here.
You also put it in the show notes. Well, the video description.
Yeah, the video. If you look in the video description, it's definitely there. I wrote a typo in there. It's in the meta. I should say that it's a YouTube video of the intro instead of it's not the calendar repo. There's video intro. Okay, done. That should be updated, and there we go. So all that information is there. With 15 minutes left, I know this is kind of a little bit of a short video that we're going through, just because, again, some of this it's a little bit more nuanced than I originally anticipated when I was looking through this yesterday night. I'm going to open the floor up to general questions from folks in the audience. Additionally, just a reminder, now that we have the URL, folks joining in, interested in writing games, Spring Lisp Game Jam registration is starting. Go to itch.io/jam/Spring Lisp Game Jam 2020 for more information. We will be having a game programming series in the coming weeks to talk about different game programming libraries available for Common Lisp. I want to also point out to folks that in addition to that, since it's from April 9th to 19th, I will be available trying to do some stuff on Mattermost and stuff, and hopefully other folks will be around to ask questions, so you guys can ask questions and enjoy writing some pretty nice, some games. But yeah, I just thought I would stop here for the period of time, just because I'd rather not, provide more white noise to folks in terms of us looking through documentation. But certainly, if there's a particular question that folks have, post them, Mattermost, IRC, wherever. And
that's a general question in terms of, looked at this exercise today. Given somebody's project, a Lisp project, Common Lisp project, what's the best way, well, assuming that there is no extensive README, what would be the best way to approach a project like this? And I think that might be a good place to start next time.
Yes, absolutely. We should, so next week, I think what we should certainly do is write a couple of use cases in terms of how the RFC is defined, and use that to spelunk the code. Usually, it takes different. It depends on the person. Okay, some folks, if it's an application, what I tend to do is I usually start in the main method and work my way down as to how things are getting set up and stuff. That's actually kind of the easy thing. For a library like this, what you rightfully pointed out is usually what you'd want to do is go in, especially in the case of protocols. This is kind of standard protocol thing. You want to look at the protocol RFC or its documentation to see what the format is. That's going to give you some sort of intuitive intuition as to how an architecture could be laid out. From there, based on reviewing the MOP, it should give you some basic starting points that you can look at. Like if for example, what we did earlier, we started with the standard types first. Let's go back to the top level here. Go to this. We started with the standard types and working our way down. But, I think this definitely requires a bit more discussion and showing how we would do a better spelunking job now that I have some of this information. One of the key things about protocol libraries that is difficult to get into and do some, design and understanding and even code review is trying to map your understanding of the protocol with the author's thinking when they designed the library implementation. Because what you might think is how you would approach this may not have been how the author approached it. And unless they've documented that clearly in a README, it certainly is a bit more difficult. In the case of Shinmera's iCalendar, he certainly actually started with the RFC at the top of his README, gave some use cases, and then started talking about the internal organization in the very last section as to how the hierarchy is there. And that, as you saw, once we saw that in the README, it gave us a good way of actually looking through with how the protocol is implemented. So for folks who are writing libraries that are implementing protocols, doing something like what Shinmera did here is providing use cases, seeing how the API is used, and then talking about the internal organization, to me, is actually a good, way of structuring your documentation. So that way, folks who want to understand the architecture in a little bit more detail, they could actually do so. For others who are really looking for how to use the library, they can just read the portions of the README that is, necessary. You don't necessarily have to do what some folks do, though, in terms of when you're reviewing some of these libraries. Sometimes they end up writing multi-page wikis with a lot of examples that are semi-contrived and not realistic. That could potentially lead to a path of misunderstanding, especially when it comes to how the MOP is used, because simple examples come up with simpler designs that may not account for all use cases, whereas a more realistic example, while simple, could actually address some of the concerns that hit 80% of the cases that most people use the library for. Anyway, that's just my thoughts. We could touch base on that a little bit more next week as we go through this. I'd like us to go through, I'm going to go through certainly the video that you sent me. I hope others do so too, as a reference as we go through this a little bit more detail. And hopefully by then I'll have some crazier examples that I brought up myself.
And the last question, I guess, would be about I put the link in the chat messages. It's about the closer to MOP.
Yes. Hold on.
So, for example, using that as an example of going through a library, because I looked at it because I wanted to find out what the MetaObject bit was, and that's not documented.
Yeah, it is not documented at all. I could not find it at all. So if you found it, that would be fantastic.
But I mean, in terms of going through a library like that, I mean, you look at the documentation first, and then probably clone the repo or install it by a quick list, and then look through the code.
Yeah.
But where would be a good place to start? That's just a general question for looking at an unfamiliar body of code, whether it be a library or an application. Where's like a good place to start, apart from the ASD file?
Personally, the ASD gives you just dependencies, but it doesn't give you the ordering in which you should be looking at the Lisp files themselves. At least I don't believe it does.
Would that be the packages.lisp file then?
You would package.lisp file would probably be a good way of starting, because you want to start with the API, the actual public interface, and work your way down. That's what I tend to do. I always look at what the exported symbols are. This way, it makes things a little bit more focused. You're not actually trying to go all over the place. And a lot of those packages.lisp files, at least I've seen, and especially with respect to Pascal Costanza's work, they tend to be pretty nice in terms of how he orders his classes, and he does that for his own reference, but it certainly shows for folks who are reading it. So that's kind of my thoughts on that. Michael, do you have any input on that?
No, that's solid advice. I mean, first thing you want to do when learning any library is check out the packages file, and hopefully they have one. Some projects adopt the, one package per file thing, so you might have to look somewhere else. There might be multiple packages in a project. But yeah, always look at the packages and what it exports, because, that's the intended API that you really need to know. And if you need to know like what some function does internally, then you could go from there. But start at the top, start at the exports, and look at that. And you should be able to get a basic idea of how the program works without being bogged down by all the internals by just scanning the files linearly. Helps a lot. Look at the package file.
Yeah.
So for Shinmera's iCalendar, we should look at define parameter first then.
Yes. We should have, in retrospect. But let's do that. Hold on a second. Package.lisp. And this is kind of nice because you could see clearly here that he defines by section what it is that he expects people to leverage.
Yeah, and I really like that style because if you just like alphabetize the symbols in the package list, like the same symbol could be used by multiple different pieces of the code.
Right.
And with this style here, you could actually list the same symbol twice. As long as it's in the right section, you know what part of the code it belongs to.
Why does he have like protocol and serializer commented out? Why would someone have file list but commented out?
This is
that's a file. That's just documenting what file that symbol is from.
It's referencing the file just so that if someone's looking at just this, and let's say they're not using Emacs, okay, and more importantly, let's say that even in the case of using Emacs, let's say they don't have a Lisp image open and they don't have this loaded, you can't actually go and use inspect symbol and go to that definition, right? Instead, he could just simply look at this, say, oh, this is in serializer.lisp, open it up and take a look at the implementation and see how it's done. So this is more of, I actually like this kind of approach just because from a Spelunking perspective, that is, from the perspective of actually investigating new code bases, you don't have to work too hard to actually go and look at a particular, API function and how it's implemented because they tell you exactly where it is. So,
yep.
It requires more work, though, of course, on the library author to be that diligent, especially when it comes to refactoring exercises, to make sure that the appropriate symbols are removed to the other appropriate locations. I'm wondering why other projects haven't adopted this, because this is actually much clearer than other stuff. But what can you do? All right. So next week, let's talk. We're continuing our MOP discussion or case studies. We're gonna still go through iCalendar, the Shinmera library for the iCalendar protocol format. Again, lists are, I put in YouTube links on the repo, the introduction that's provided by Shinmera himself, thanks to Richie Primus, as well as additional links related to like the MOP specification. And for those of you who are watching this later on in your leisure, if you are looking to play write video games, I also provided the itch.io URL to register for 2020 this year's 2020 Game Jam. So until next week, thanks so much for joining us, and I'll see you guys later.
Thank you.
Bye.